This is the first Lyxe adventure story. In the timeline of the Megaryung universe, this story takes place when Ryung is on planet Ophardum in a coma. BlackKenji wrote the original story. Link in the description. Content: this story contains elements of giantess and rampage. It wasn't until you were out of the city that you realized just how cacophonous nature could be. Though absent were the honking of cars, screeching of tires, men shouting, and all that hassle, the great swamp in front of Noldor was by no means less noisy. The wind whispered through the canopy of towering sequoias, and the slimy mud churned and bubbled, every now and again bursting open to release a thick cloud of gas into the air. It could only be seen a very short moment, then the gas vanished in the gray cloud of fog that smothered the landscape underneath its melancholic weight. And on top of everything, the pitter-patter of the eternal rain, the drops thumping down onto the leaves, the swamp, the thin, metal roof that protected Noldor from the weather as he sat out on his porch. He loved it. Out here, on the border of the Soul City that existed on planet Baywa, was the only place you could somewhat find peace. He leaned against the railing, content with watching the display in front of him. The sequoias half vanished into the bank of the fog, leaving only their silhouettes visible, and as such they appeared less than trees, but more like mystical giants that were content in merely watching Noldor in turn. A welcome change from the slick, gray steel and glass of the skyscrapers that would greet him if he turned around. Like the old man he was, he shook his head slightly. People always live in the most ugly places, he murmured, when all this is out here. Sure, Grandpa, a small voice said beside him, and Noldor turned to look at his granddaughter, ready to launch into a lecture about his thought process. But he was cut off by her pulling his arm and pointing back into the city. Can I get some ice cream? Of course, Nova. Just go, I'll keep an eye on you from up here. Nova's face twisted into a pout. You don't need to do that. I'm grown up, remember? Grown-ups don't need to remind me that they're old enough to buy ice cream. Ugh, you're such a stuffy, old, I'm only teasing, Nova, Noldor laughed. He dug his hand into his pocket and pulled out a thin, slick piece of plastic and pushed it into his granddaughter's hands. Get yourself whatever you like. The slight against her already forgotten, Nova clutched the card and skipped away to the ice cream shop. Noldor smiled and shook his head again. Hardly the weather for ice cream. Kids, it had been a month ago, to the day, that Noldor retired, and he was still finding it difficult to get used to it. He was, as his wife sometimes said, a workhorse. He had always needed something to keep himself busy, to occupy his mind, to just work. In the first week of his retirement, he had not only once, but twice forgotten that he wasn't supposed to come into his office anymore. The first time, everyone had a good laugh at seeing the old man sit down at his desk and asking what needed to be done. The second time, everyone was still laughing, though it took some time for Noldor to explain that no, he wasn't having difficulty with his memory. It thankfully hadn't happened again afterwards, though he was still waking up way too early for his age, half of the time jumping up in his bed before he remembered that he wasn't late for work. He had been a linguist, a fact that his portly stature and old, beat-up glasses made no secret of, and ever since he arrived on Baywa, he had worked with the same company to develop and refine their translation software. Work had kept him busy. But now, he hardly had any reason to get up at all in the morning. Well, that wasn't quite true. His eyes wandered over to the ice cream shop and a slight smile crept over his face. If anything, his granddaughter was more reason to get up than any work could possibly be. Though he couldn't help but wonder if he was too late in realizing that. Noldor's pondering was interrupted by a sudden, loud bang, a whipping noise as if some aircraft above him had broken through the sound barrier. Blinking in shock, he looked upwards to search for the source of the noise. At first, he didn't see anything through the thick fog. No sign of an aircraft. Had he made a mistake? Nolder turned back around, searching for the site of an accident or maybe just something heavy that had fallen over. But behind him, he could only see a few other people doing the same as him, searching for whatever had made this noise. His eyes turned back to the sky, and suddenly he saw something. They were hard to see at first. For small objects, their orange glow dimmed by the fog descended towards the planet. Nolder couldn't tell where they came from, nor what exactly they were. From down here, it was impossible to discern their shape and they simply seemed like orbs of light. They definitely didn't look like ordinary planes, but also not like any spaceship Nolder had ever seen. The light slowed their descent and began to spiral, dragging thin trails of light behind them that twisted into a helix shape. As they reached a certain height, approximately 300 feet above Nolder, they stopped completely for a moment. The next, they shot out in all directions, leaving 4 orange lines etched into the sky. The lines formed a square and their once dim light was growing brighter by the second. Nolder's eyes widened and his glasses slid down his nose and fell. He reacted barely quick enough to catch them from shattering against the ground and rushed to put them back on his nose, to get a better look at the strange phenomenon above him. "Is that a portal?" he murmured, equal parts afraid and excited by the sight. A moment later his question was answered as the line's glow intensified into a sudden, all-encompassing flash of light. Nolder threw his hands up to protect his eyes from the assault of radiance and heat. Yet not even screwing his eyes shut could keep it out. It was as if he was staring directly into a sun, the light digging under his eyelids and turning everything a bright red. Then, he felt something. Something was coming. Every hair on Nolder's neck stood on end. It was as if an electric spark rushed through his body as an instinctive fear rushed through the old man. The fear of danger. He could feel it all around him. Whatever was approaching, Nolder was afraid of it on a more primal level than anything he had ever felt. Already, his legs commanded him to run, but at the same time he was frozen in place. Not just because of conflicting biological impulses, but also because he was curious. What was that thing? Slowly, he lowered his shaking hands and opened his eyes. For but a moment, he caught a glimpse of something. Something pink. Something huge. Then, a violent tremor shook the earth and Nolder was knocked off his feet. The world blurred in front of him as he fell back, his head rushing towards the pavement. Meanwhile on board a battleship, Seth leaned back in his chair, his feet stretched out in front of him, and he was just about to take a big sip of coffee when suddenly an alarm blared out from the console in front of him. He sputtered, inhaled some coffee, and coughed it out all over the radar system. With a grunt, he wiped the liquid off the screen with his sleeve and stared at it. His eyes widened. Holy crap! Where did those come from? Something the matter? Lieutenant? The gruff voice of his superior officer rang out behind him, and already he could feel his steely eyes bore into his back. I think so, Commander. His voice was impatient. Could you be more precise, Lieutenant? Yes, sir. Seth sputtered, finding his discipline again, for unidentified flight objects have appeared on the radar system just now. They must be very small. Our long-range sensors didn't detect anything. It's almost as if they appeared out of 4 objects? The commander's voice cut off his explanation. 4? Are you sure of that? Yes, sir. Why? Does that pattern mean something? But Seth's question went ignored as the commander jumped out of his own chair, his voice roaring across the room. Silent alarm immediately. All interceptors ready. You will keep your eyes on those objects, Seth. I want to know where they are going. Everything, understood? And someone call the mayor. I need to talk with him. Meanwhile, at the border of the city. Grandpa. Nova's voice brought Nolder back to consciousness. Immediately, he tried to sit upright, but the sudden movement made his head swim and he choked as bile rose up in his throat. However, it only took a moment for his dizziness to vanish. He raised a hand to his head, letting his fingers comb through his hair in search of injury. But when he looked at them again, there was no blood. Immense relief came over Nolder. He was sure his head bounced off the pavement, but he had been extraordinarily lucky. There was no injury, and the nausea was already subsiding. Are you all right, Grandpa? Nolder's head snapped sideways, worry flooding through him. He had been so preoccupied with his own health that Nova had completely slipped his mind. The old man kicked himself mentally. How could he? As his eyes fell upon her, he was once again relieved. Nova stood over him, holding one of his hands. She had to have found him when he was unconscious. Her bright red hair was tousled somewhat, though it was hard to tell the difference between now and any other day, but other than that, she seemed fine. Not even a bruise. Nolder could hardly believe his eyes. The most injured part of her was actually the ice cream cone she still clutched, somewhat smushed, in her left hand. Yes, I'm fine. Are you all right, Nova? Yeah. Did you fall because of the earthquake? Nolder didn't know whether he should be relieved or not that he hadn't imagined the tremor. He fought himself back to his feet, gave Nova another quick once-over, then searched for the cause of the light in the sky. Nothing. As if they had never even existed. There was no trace of the orange lights in the sky anymore. Yes, honey. It knocked me clean off my socks. Did you see what it was? I only saw something big fall out of the sky, but I couldn't quite see it with all that light. No, Grandpa. I couldn't see anything, I was inside. Nova pointed to the ice cream store. The blue ball on top of her cone was dripping, specks of ice cream pooling on the pavement. Did something bad happen? I don't know, honey. But whatever has happened, I think we best head home. There's people to deal with things like that, and the best thing we can do right now is get out of there. Look. Nolder was interrupted by his granddaughter, who suddenly pulled his arm in the opposite direction. The old man was almost sent to the ground again but caught himself. Nova, what in the world? There, she said, barely catching her breath, there's something in the forest. Something big. It's just a tree, Nova. Now come. We should get home as quickly as we can. Another tremor shook the earth and Nolder yelped, clutching the railing to keep himself upright. With clear apprehension, he turned again to the swamp, squinting his eyes. Around him, many more people had stopped, already ready to run at a moment's notice, yet transfixed by their own curiosity. Another ominous quake rumbled through the ground. A nearby car jumped slightly, and immediately its alarm began blaring. Still, Nolder as well as everyone else simply kept staring into the fog. Thud. Boom. This time, the sound was deafening. As if an entire mountain had collapsed, the deep, dull boom of something heavy falling on hard ground rang out over the swamp and Baywa City. Nolder's ears were ringing, and he wasn't alone in that. Around him many of the spectators clutched their hands over their ears, their anxiousness turning into actual fear. Still, they stood in place. The entire city had gone quiet. Not even the sound of the swamp could be heard as the air thickened with a dreadful anticipation. All at once, a massive, cacophonous crash broke the tension in the air. Nolder's eyes widened as he saw the silhouette of one of those massive sequoias break like a twig and fall to the side with an eardrum-shattering boom. A mere moment later, another one followed. Then another, and another. Like matchsticks, the towering canopy was reduced to splinters and another shape took their place in the fog. It was the same thing he had seen come out of the portal, Nolder was sure of it. This time he got a better look. The creature was massive. But even that word was hardly enough to describe it. For once, Nolder was utterly lost for words. In all his life, his career, he had never encountered a word in any language that could convey just how utterly gigantic this being was. From inside the swamp, it watched the city before it. It was hard to make out details, but the longer he stared the more Nolder could see. The creature was reptile in nature, that much seemed obvious. Its head was somewhat flat and the face ended in a broad snout. 6 tentacle-like protrusions spread from its head, 3 on each side, making it look as if it had 6 pairs of ears. In the middle sat 2 enormous orbs of a piercing blue. Its eyes were wide open and trained directly onto the city. Though the fog obscured most of it, he could make out that its skin was pink, at least at the head. Further down beneath the throat its skin changed to a vibrant orange tone that reached all the way over its torso and lower stomach. Before it changed back to the same pink. The coloration of its legs changed drastically to a deep black. Nolder shook his head in disbelief. For some reason, the strange, chaotic coloration of this lurking titan surprised him. That didn't seem natural. But then again, a being of this size wasn't natural either. An eternity passed as Nolder, as well as his granddaughter, couldn't help but stare at those gargantuan blue eyes. The creature sat there, crouched on all fours, simply staring back. The silence was deafening. It was as if the world was standing still, quietly awaiting the Titan's next move. Suddenly, the creature moved with a speed that seemed impossible. In one fluent motion, it threw itself forward and dove into the swamp. With a deafening splash, it dropped its unfathomable mass into the water and a wave the size of a building shot forward, rushing directly towards the harbor. Still, behind the wall of water Nolder could see a massive, pink tail loom upwards. The appendage was covered at the top and bottom in purple fins, and it swayed from side to side, foretelling the creature's intent. "It's coming towards us," Nova shouted, childish excitement creeping into her voice despite the gargantuan wave rushing towards them. Nolder didn't lose any time. He grabbed his granddaughter by her arm and pulled her with him. With the creature's movement, the spell over the gathered crowd had been broken. All around him, a cacophony of screams rang out as the people realized the danger they were in. "We need to get out of here. Get home. Or somewhere." Nolder sputtered as he made his way to the main street. "We'll just get to the car, honey. Then we'll get away from the monster." "No." Nova shouted behind him, resisting his pull. "This is no time for games, Nova." Nolder raised his voice, "If we stay here, this thing is gonna kill us." "No, look. We can't go that way, Grandpa." "What in the world are you talking about?" But he trailed off as he followed her pointed arm and saw what his granddaughter meant. In front of them was a wall of people. Men, women, children, all trying to squeeze through a street that was suddenly much too small for the crowd. Already he could see some being knocked to the ground as others rushed over them with reckless abandon. Nolder gulped. He couldn't bring Nova through there. If he lost her, he couldn't even imagine it. No, he wouldn't risk it. But another deafening crash behind him made it all the more clear that they had to go somewhere. The monster was coming directly towards them with a speed that seemed impossible. Though he could see some military ships in the harbor, he doubted that they would slow it down all that much. He had to think fast. "We can't run," Nolder mumbled, "and we can't stay here. That leaves." His eyes wandered over the harbor until they fell on a close-by dock. Shipping containers that were just about to be loaded onto a freighter lay about. One still dangling from the enormous crane. Nolder grunted with frustration and grabbed Nova even tighter. It was risky, and by far not what he wanted to do. But he had no other choice unless he wanted to swim out of the city. The exit from the harbor was blocked with countless people lost to blind panic. So the only choice he had was to hide. "Come, Nova." Nolder's voice brooked no argument, "and be quick. We are going to get away from here, I promise you." As he pulled her with him, Nolder shot one last glance to the water. A battleship was turning on its engines and was about to meet the monster out in the water. Those men and women were about to fight something much larger than even the biggest building in this city. He felt pity for them, and couldn't help but to admire their bravery. Multi was shaking in his boots. Despite his uniform. Despite his bulletproof vest. And despite his heavy assault rifle that limply lay in his hands. Despite all that, he felt utterly naked as he saw the gigantic purple tail cut the water in two as it rushed towards the sorrel. His only comfort was that he wasn't the only one feeling this way. "Holy crap. This can't be real," another soldier right next to him mumbled. A young one, even younger than Multi himself. This was probably his first mission, and by the looks of it probably would be his last one. Multi stopped himself from continuing the thought and shook his head. Instead, he forced a smile onto his face and gave the boy a slap on the shoulder. "Hey," he said, "guess we get to try out the big guns, huh?" Multi pointed forwards. With a mechanical whir, the enormous gun tower moved into the direction of the beast. 5 massive barrels poked out of it, each one with a diameter larger than 2 people standing on top of each other. That's the latest craze. Massive anti-battleship weapons. Some sort of prototype, I heard. I only saw it once in action though. Blew an entire S-class corvette to pieces with a single hit. He gave the boy another pat on the shoulder. Multi's cheeks were beginning to hurt from his smile. "So I wonder what it'll do to that damn alien thing." "Don't you? Bet we'll see some crazy fireworks." Apparently his words hit a chord with the young soldier, who also tried his best to get a grin on his face as he stared at the tower. He turned to Multi to say something, but was cut off by a shout. 30 seconds till arrival." The captain shouted, "All troops get ready. Aim. Fire on sight." This was it. Multi let out a deep breath that he hadn't realized he was holding and raised his rifle, the butt against his shoulder. He narrowed one eye, the other staring unblinking down the sights. He crouched down, got into a stable position. Though with as big a target that was coming to them, accuracy probably didn't matter much. 15 seconds till arrival. The captain's voice rang out again. The gargantuan tail came closer and closer, but Multi hardly heard it anymore. Not the sloshing of the water, nor his captain's voice shouting orders. No, the only sound he could still hear was that of his own thunderous heartbeat. Every second felt like a minute as he could do nothing but stare at that gargantuan shape rushing closer. 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 Was it swaying faster? Or was he just trembling so much that he could not keep the creature in his sights? It didn't matter. All he had to do was pull the trigger. No matter how much his teeth were chattering, he had to stop this monster. But just as the tail finally took shape out of the fog, just when he was about to use his weapon, the gargantuan appendage suddenly took a dive downwards, Within an instant, it had disappeared from sight, simply gliding under the surface with an almost elegant movement. The water was hardly disturbed. "Hold," the captain's voice thundered. A moment passed. Malty could still feel his heartbeat in his ears. He looked down his rifle at the swamp, then, as if a bomb had burst underwater, a gargantuan wave rose into the sky as the titanic creature surfaced again. This time, however, it was her head that now loomed in front of them. Malty's jaw dropped at the sight, his rifle almost slipping out of his grasp. "Fire!" he heard his commander yell. But he simply couldn't move his finger, so lost was he in beholding the creature in front of him. It was almost human. Well, human-like at least. Its skull was a little more flat than a human's for one. Its eyes were large, and of a deep blue that he felt he was sinking into, as if he was drowning in the ocean. From each side of her head, 3 strange protrusions spouted forward, covered in odd growths. The sight was familiar to Malty. These protrusions looked almost like the external gills of an axolotl. From the top of its head, silver hair fell down its shoulders, where its purple skin changed into a bright orange just below its neck. Or was that? "Hang on," Malty murmured to himself, hardly believing his eyes, "that isn't skin, is it?" But just as he was raising his head to get a closer look, he snapped back to reality as the crack of dozens of rifles suddenly filled the air. "I said fire," the captain yelled, his voice somehow carrying over the cacophony. Malty regained his senses, and at once, he got into position again, raised his weapon and began firing. They would stop this monster right here. Right now. This rifle was state-of-the-art. It had been by his side when he was escorting convoys through the deserts of Faringa, and had saved his life on more than one occasion. It had a magazine that fit 205.56 mm bullets, each one more than capable of piercing a man's skull. And all of them bounced uselessly off the giant in front of him. After a minute, he had emptied his magazine. Yet the creature didn't even flinch as countless bullets stuck it. Instead, it only tilted its oddly shaped, lizard-like head. Malty's mind was racing. Just then it occurred to him this thing wasn't acting much like a monster. Not like one he would imagine, in any case. It wasn't roaring, or gnashing its teeth, or simply react to their assault. If anything, it looked slightly annoyed. But they still had one thing. Malty knew that their attack was only to distract the creature from the actual threat. And already he could hear the whirring of the cannon tower. He looked over, grinning at the 5 massive barrels that were pointing directly at the monster's skull. He let his rifle fall and put his hands on his ears. "So long, you freak!" he yelled. Next thing he knew, a thunderous crash rang out as all 5 barrels shot at once. It felt as if the air itself had been ripped apart by the projectiles. In a fraction of a second, the monster's face had gone from idly staring at the battleship to being enveloped in smoke as 5 bolts of steel and gunpowder struck it, an explosion of fire and light bursting forth out of each of them. Malty was glad for that. The sight had to be absolutely brutal. Even as a soldier, he had never gotten used to the sight of the aftermath of weapons such as these, even if they were being used against a monster. Who? The younger soldier next to him hollered, pumping his fist in the air triumphantly. Many others soon followed with their own jubilant shouts, and even the whip-like command of the captain didn't manage to contain their celebration fully. But then, the smoke cleared, and their proud calls died on their lips. There it was, the monster, its face still towering over them. Unharmed, utterly so. A weight suddenly filled Malty's stomach. The panic that he had kept choked down within him now returned in full force. His hands were shaking and the rifle fell out of his damp hands. This was impossible. He had seen firsthand what those cannons were able to do. They could take down ships twice the size of this one. A being of flesh and blood had no chance against that. They had to have missed. Right? But no, he had seen the explosion, had seen its head bathed in fire. And yet, it didn't even flinch, didn't even take a scratch. It simply kept staring at them. But this time, it didn't look annoyed anymore. No. It was angry. All of a sudden, two gargantuan appendages shot out of the water, showering Malty with thick drops of the briny swamp. A blur of purple and orange shot past him before the deafening screech of metal made his ears ring. The ground underneath him buckled and bent. Malty lost his footing, landing hard on his side, and began sliding down the deck. A panicked scream escaped him and his right hand shot out. Just barely, he managed to grip a beam of the metal handrail, just in time to see his rifle slid past him. But he didn't pay it any mind. Instead, he turned his head in terrified awe at the sight that was before him. Two massive hands had dug into the ship, each gripping one end. The gigantic digits were sharp and pointed, and most importantly thicker than a structural beam, and had dug deep into the steel hull of the ship as if it was made of little more than papier-mâché. And on each side, the creature was pressing down. The middle of the deck bent upwards into a sharp point while the sides were pointing downward. Beside him, his comrades were screaming desperate pleas to the heavens. Only a few had been as lucky as Malty. Most had been standing behind him and now, with nothing to hold on to, they slid down the ever-steepening deck towards the swamp. The sharp sound of tearing metal rang in his ears and Malty could feel his grip slipping as more and more gravity was pulling on him. Finally, with one last push, the monster brought its hands down and together. The ship broke in two with a sudden jerk and Malty's eyes widened as he was suddenly flung forward, off of the ship and towards the dark murkiness of the swamp. For just a few, breathtaking moments, he was flying. His mind suddenly cleared. Mid-air, he turned his head as the world slowed down around him. These were his last moments, he was sure of it. But still, there was something compelling him to look back. The monster simply sat there as countless men and women fell to their deaths, staring at the now broken ship with an annoyed glare. But like a spoiled child, in just a moment it seemingly lost interest and simply let the two halves fall into the water as its eyes turned and focused on the harbor before it. As the world sped up again, and Malty fell to his death, he hoped that the captain had the sense to call for an evacuation order. Nolder could not tear his eyes away. Nor could he run. Or even scream. The old man was utterly paralyzed as he spied out from his hiding place and saw the warship being broken in half like a twig. It was as if his blood had turned to ice. He didn't even notice how tightly he was gripping Nova's hand until she yelled in pain. "Come on, Grandpa. We need to hurry," her voice cut through the air, bringing him back to reality, and he turned just in time to see the monster dive beneath the surface again. Its tail rose upward and began swaying from side to side, propelling it forward. Nolder cursed audibly. They had rushed away from the crowds that were still blocking the exit from the harbor and instead fled towards the docks. Nolder had hoped that he would have enough time to find a hiding spot between all those shipping containers. But the warship had barely lasted a minute. They hadn't even reached the docks yet and now Nolder was confronted with the terrifying realization that he and Nova were in the worst possible place to be, out in the open. Quickly, he turned his head. They would never reach the shipping containers before the monster arrived. But they couldn't just stay out here. There had to be something they could hide in, anything that would get them out of this beast's sight. Finally, his eyes fell on a small shack, about 40 meters away. The door was hanging open, it looked like the entrance to a small bar or restaurant. Nolder was certain that this building would not stand a chance against the creature, but at this moment he didn't care. All he needed was to get out of sight. "Come on," he shouted, dragging Nova with him who did her best to keep up. They made it halfway towards their hiding spot, before a massive explosion sent both of them tumbling. A deluge of murky swamp water descended on them, soaking them to their core. Nolder sputtered and turned around, but he couldn't see anything but shapes. In a panic, he brought his hand to his face. His glasses. They were gone. Nova. He screamed, terrified, whipping his head from side to side in the hope of seeing the blur of color that was his granddaughter. But when he looked forward, his voice died in his throat. Purple. All he could see in front of him was purple. Then orange. And then the sound of warping, bending, crushing metal as an unfathomable weight was dropping on countless buildings in front of him. Even though he couldn't see clearly, Nolder knew what it was. The monster had reached the harbor and it was coming ashore. Its body rose up into the sky, larger than a skyscraper. Its claws dug into the cement of the harbor, tearing trenches through it as if it was paper. It lifted its towering form onto land. One gigantic leg now rising from the water and stepping down on another row of warehouses, breaking them beneath with hardly any resistance. Grandpa. Nova's voice cut through the air and suddenly Nolder felt her hands wrap around his arm. Get up. We need to leave. She sounded afraid. Panicked. Terrified. Yet still, there was something else. A curiosity that even now as the gargantuan creature was hardly a stone's throw away from them couldn't be driven out of her. Nolder came back to his senses as his granddaughter pulled on him. Ahead, the monster had finally lifted itself onto land and now towered over them. He turned and tried to get up, only for a sharp pain in his leg to topple him again. His eyes widened. The adrenaline inside him had let him ignore it for the moment. But now, his leg was aching right above the ankle. He had to have twisted it when he fell. Run, Nova. He screamed, I can't keep up. Get yourself safe. No. She protested, weakly pulling on him, desperate to get him to his feet. Not without you. Get yourself home to Mom and Dad. Nolder begged. Behind him, he could feel a shadow eclipsing the sky. The sound of cracking concrete filled the air as a massive weight shifted. He saw Nova grow pale and immediately she redoubled her efforts. I'm not leaving you here. Nolder couldn't help but be proud. She really was an amazing girl. For a moment, he wanted to shove her away. But he couldn't. Instead, he wrapped his arm around her, pulled her close. The sky above him darkened. I love you, Nova. He muttered as he closed his eyes, hugging her as tight as he could. And then, with a thunderous crash, the gigantic soul above him descended. A ceiling of purple rushed down to meet the ground. He could hear the air being pressed down, heard the concrete break as its foot descended. Heard his granddaughter scream. Everything went black. End of Part 1, Lyxe, Attack on Baywa City. The original story was written by BlackKenji. You can find the link in the description. Lyxe, the giant Axolotl Kaiju girl, is an original character from Cormany Media. Subscribe to our channel for more stories and check out our main channel for short films starring the gentle giantess Ryung. Of course we are happy about comments and a thumbs up. Thanks for listening.